There we go. Hello. Ta-da.
Oh,
Hello, everybody. It's Tom and Kamal coming to you on the heels of a nice interview with the erudite and inimitable James Tunney. We're going to be talking with the erudite and also inimitable Kamal Southall to maybe touch on some points in the interview, background, sort of historical or historiographic in character, because in a sense, the Tunney interview, which was dealing with the net of Scientocracy, while touching on historical developments and considerations, had a sort of theoretical flavor to it. But there were things mentioned in the course of that interview, with which I was not particularly well acquainted, and I'm assuming that I'm not the only one in that circumstance, such as, for example, the Macy Group. Or there are other things too, like the Five Eyes, and so on, and these points of intersection, the X Club, so on, right? These sort of historical organizations, agendas, and so forth. I thought maybe because Kamal knows more than a little bit about these things, he might help flesh that picture out for us. And then we can always return to a consideration theoretically of what is Scientocracy, what is potentially problematic about Scientocracy, and so on and so forth. So anyway, it's enough of my statements of prologue. Turn over to the autodidact and scholar in his own right, though no doubt he will attempt to resist that characterization, Kamal Southall. So, hello, Kamal.
hey, Tom. It's great to see you again.
Nothing as awkward as an unanticipated compliment. But
yes, and wholly undeserved compliments.
So,
thank you for kind words.
So, pish posh. So,
yeah, it's great to again, and great to hear your voice. So yeah, I really enjoyed watching your James Tunney interview. It was very informative and quite fascinating. And may I ask you one quick favor?
Of course.
Is it possible to edit out the next 30 seconds?
Edit out the next 30 seconds?
Yes. We post it. Or is it possible for us to stop the recording and start it again?
Yes. Here we go.
I'm sorry. Oh no.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Awesome.
We're back on. You know what it was? We didn't even stop the recording for 10 seconds. There was a kitchen consideration. And if I had known that, I wouldn't even have paused the recording, because I like to retain the humanity of the interaction as far as possible. That's why I'm eating a piece of pizza. But yeah,
sure
so, conceptually, Scientocracy, you have the notion of, if you like, handing over decisions that historically have a political character to them to artificial arbitration. And here the artificial is constituted by a body that's sometimes referred to as science. But of course, that term has an indeterminate quality, which oftentimes leads to its abuse. And in this case, I think would almost structurally lead to that abuse. So much by way of like another sort of theoretical foreshadowing of what we're going to discuss. Parts of those developments can be understood as a consequence of the philosophical climate of modernity, postmodernity, and so forth. But those ideas also motivate and are motivated by people in power, people with names and addresses, as the saying tends to go. And so one space of interest is the Macy Conference. And I don't know much about it, but it's was seen as Mr. Tunney, and I believe you said that you were largely in accord with his understanding as a kind of significant moment in these developments. So maybe you could go from there. Like, what is the Macy Group and so forth?
So, and I was very pleasantly surprised to hear him reference some of these matters. So the Macy Group is kind of an informal, the Macy Group per se is an informal name that some researchers have given to a group of researchers who participated in a set of Macy conferences, right? So the Macy Foundation, the Josiah Macy Jr. Foundation, inaugurated a set of conferences back in the 1940s. And they really aimed at doing an interdisciplinary study of subjects related to medicine, broadly speaking, to sort of overcome a lot of the boundaries between the disciplines and some very fancy, gobbledygook that's probably cooked up by a public relations firm. But yeah, essentially the Josiah Macy Foundation wanted to spur innovations in
Can I ask you, who is
fields of.
Josiah? Who is Josiah Macy?
Oh, good question. Josiah Macy was a very rich person, and the Josiah Macy Foundations was the Josiah Macy Foundation was not founded by Josiah Macy Jr. Rather, it was founded by his daughter, Katie Lund. But Josiah Macy was an interesting 19th century character. He was a very wealthy man, became a philanthropist later in his life, and he was a sea captain, kind of a merchant sea captain. And his fortune was largely made in his nautical enterprises, I guess one would say. And his daughter, after he died, diverted a lot of the family's fortune into establishing a foundation for philanthropic giving to explore questions concerning science and medicine and so on and so forth. So, for example, Albert Einstein received money from the Josiah Macy Foundation from a fellowship that was established to benefit Einstein and some other colleagues of his, just as one example. So, excuse me. So the Macy Foundation was established around 1930, and it was established by Captain Josiah Macy's daughter. And it
So was
gave a
she a
lot of
person
money.
Did she have particular ideological commitments herself, or is that something that happens subsequently?
I suspect she did. But from what little I know of her biography, I would really just be
Speculating.
I would be engaging in irresponsible speculation when it comes
So
to
what
her.
about the conferences themselves?
So the conferences themselves examine a wide range of topics related to many aspects of healthcare, medicine, pardon me. The conferences, though, that most researchers into the kind of subjects that Mr. Tunney made reference to are mostly concerned with the cybernetics conferences. So it's popularly said, a little inaccurately, that starting in 1942, the Macy Foundation inaugurated a set of conferences to examine cybernetics. That's not exactly true. the famous cybernetic conferences were started in 1946, but they were preceded by a 1942 conference that sort of kind of kicked it off. And this 1942 conference really largely set the tone for what became a very long line of Macy conferences extending into the 1950s. And largely, I think, has a somewhat underrated role in shaping an immense amount of the post-war scientific and social climate. Because out of the Macy's conferences, the first one in 1942, not the first conference, but the first one relevant to matters concerning cybernetics, was actually the cerebral inhibition meeting. And the cerebral inhibition meeting was largely established to address two questions. One was hypnosis, and that subject was introduced by the famous and groundbreaking hypnotist Milton Erickson. And I'm not sure if you've come across Erickson or references to Erickson in your readings and study. But Erickson was an innovator in hypnotic technique and a lot of actual, for example, neurolinguistic programming, NLP. The entire field of NLP was largely based on Erickson's work by individuals who learned from many of Erickson's students and were seeking initially a sort of therapeutic modality that would overcome a lot of the limitations in psychotherapy and also techniques of, I guess, human cognitive improvement and things of this nature at the time. So these two guys, Bandler and Grinder.
I already have like things to say, but I'm gonna hold my tongue for a minute, right? So you said there were two.
I'm going into tangent. Yeah, this is a bit of a.
Well, it's not a tangent. The cerebral inhibition meeting, 1946. First of the set of
1942. Yeah, the cerebral inhibition meeting was in 1942. Sorry.
My apologies. But already you have the hint of the dimension of control, hypnosis, and what was the other major?
Oh, you'll love this. Conditioned reflex.
Okay. So we're in a still a behaviorist milieu where behaviorism was the ascendant, dominant, so-called scientific model with reference to how to interact with human beings. Consistent with the foci being innovating hypnosis on the one hand and seeing how conditioned behavior, reflexively conditioning, what was it again? How did you put it?
Condition reflex and hypnosis. Well,
condition reflexivity and hypnosis for the two. So right at the outset, even before we get into what we termed cybernetics per se, you have an interest in the development of techniques that are essentially directed to the manipulation of human activity.
Yes, and the individuals invited for the first conference are also interesting in their own right. So one is Margaret Mead, the famous anthropologist, and her husband, Gregory Bateson. And Gregory Bateson is a fairly interesting individual. He's indirectly connected or implicated with the rather torturous MK Ultra quote unquote research that the CIA conducted in the 1950s and 60s, and were finally spanked, and the auspices of the church committee told you knock that naughty torturing people with psychedelic drugs and other things to do whatever they claim to be doing. But Bateson claimed, and other people in his defense claimed, that he wasn't knowingly connected with that, but there is evidence that has come to light in one of his papers and the papers of other scholars associated with the field, like quote unquote Jolly West, psychologist, psychiatrist, and it definitely seems highly probable and likely that Bateson was knowingly associated with, which is again a tangent, but knowingly associated with NK Ultra, or at least, if not knowingly, just excuse my phone, this having fits, was his research and skills and talents were being used by individuals.
Totally in the service of Central Intelligence Agency that was interested in using psychoactive drugs to manipulate behavior and possibly scale that project to a population tier or stratum.
Right.
For those who are not familiar with MK Ultra, that accurate characterization of the program?
I think that's fairly accurate. I mean, that's what the Wikipedia page would largely indicate. Although one good friend of mine,
that indicates, by the way, it's an incredibly muted, understated characterization that the kind of bilious and diabolical things that were done under its auspices exceed what I could have relayed here.
Yes.
Just to go on the record as being unequivocally condemning of MK Ultra, but
and unfortunately, much of the paperwork was shredded too.
Get all drawn off. And it isn't that straight of the net. So if you'll forgive me to come back, 42, you've got this conference, cerebral inhibition, itself kind of an instructive name.
Right, cerebral inhibition. They weren't exactly subtle.
People from
convening the cerebral inhibition meeting.
You inhibit their cerebral activity. Anyway.
There's other people, Frank Beach and Carl Binger, I can never pronounce his name, but it was a fairly small working group of psychologists and psychiatrists. And the work that was done in that meeting sort of set the ground for the later full-scale cybernetic conferences, which were inaugurated in 1946. They ran between 1946 and 1953. And they include a far wider roster of researchers. And the famous mathematician, and you could call him founding father of artificial intelligence in a certain sense, Turing himself was associated with this group. And I think if I was reading Tunning's discourse correctly, I think he was drawing the line between the research of people like Alan Turing and the mathematicians who largely developed a lot of his ideas after his death, and the theme of control of human consciousness and human cognition that was explored, among other things, in these conferences. So yeah, it's fairly fascinating. And Turing himself, while he had a connection with the individuals who largely constituted these group of Macy Foundation organized researchers, he himself being British, other than, he was largely also connected with something called the, if I recall correctly, the Racial Club. Did the two of you discuss the Racial Club during
I don't
your
believe
interview?
that
I'm trying to
specifically
recall.
came up. I don't think that particular, if it came up under a different moniker.
Okay. But he did mention the X Club, which was it was fascinating that he mentioned that. So the
There are
racial
two
club.
other groups that are interested in the X Club. I'm also interested in the elaboration of what are the five eyes to which he refers. But to sort of
Okay.
recapitulate what we've, or to ask a question rather, right? So you have then like from this outset 42 and 46, there's a shift to the cybernetics or the notion of, cybernetics. It's interesting that Turing is a significant mind there because Turing contributes to a lot of the theoretical foundations of what is understood by computing and so forth, as you already said. But he's interfacing with a whole consortium of individuals. The only thing I wanted to sort of inflect about that connection is you have a model of human beings which is fundamentally mechanistic. You see that
Mm.
already, that at the outset you have the endorsement of reflexive conditioning and a particular spin on hypnosis. I thought it in a sort of amusing. They said trying to deal with the limits of psychotherapy. I mean, I was amused by that remark because I don't know if that's actually fair to psychotherapy, or at least certain kinds of psychotherapy, which provide a context in which the patient can come to a new and kind of radical freedom. Whereas hypnosis, while it can be used in a liberating manner, oftentimes has a contrary effect, or so it's my impression. With that being said, I was going to ask you, how did they constitute, or how would they describe the cybernetic? What did they mean by the cybernetic?
Well, and
It's
so
kind of a
the
slippery
actual
term.
conference. I'm sorry. Pardon me. Go ahead.
No, that's fine. Go on.
Oh, so there were a set of papers and a body of research that came out of the Macy conferences, and I would not um, I would not remotely want to pretend that I've waded through any of that material to any depth. Um, my interest in the Macy conferences, my personal interest, largely came as a result of my interest in some of the individuals who were involved, and my interest in kind of the formation of cybernetics, the conceptualization of cybernetics, and notions of creating a kind of command and control structures and things of this nature, and um, the evolution of ideas concerning mechanical brains, electronic brains, and computer technology as we have it today, and how that came out of earlier, perhaps naive conceptualizations of human neurology, and more of just kind of the archaeology of ideas. That's something that was a great interest to me. But my understanding of the goal of the Macy Foundation's cybernetic conferences was, broadly speaking, they aimed at constructing a vast interdisciplinary kind of general broad science of the human mind itself. What makes the human mind work? What makes it tick? How do humans take in and process information? How do humans derive meaning from information? What are the behavioral patterns of the human mind, and so on and so forth. So these were some of the the broadly discussed aims of the conferences was largely aimed at particular line. And they also like they I don't remember the whole range of conferences that the Macy Foundation kicked off, but the cybernetics conferences were only one series out of many. Some were devoted to a number of other um, medical problems.
But
So,
what did they
like
mean by a
reaction
medical?
to stimulus. Like, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Like I was going to ask for an example of a medical problem that they examined, quote unquote.
Uh, fan, Phantom limb syndrome. So, phantom limb syndrome, which was obviously of some concern after the war, given the massive disablement of many people, um, amputations, and the like. So the whole what phantom limb syndrome was and how it could be addressed and what the implications of phantom limb syndrome. Um,
So that is like a
mhm,
fascinating example that you raise, because on the one hand, you have a group of people who are involved in a highly reductionist approach to human being, right? And of course, they're not like a homogenous group. These are different individuals. But then you have the examination of the phenomenon of phantom limb syndrome. And what that actually brought to my mind is the work of Rupert Sheldrake, who is often
hmm,
considered to be associated with the exploration of paranormal phenomena. And he
hmm,
did a lot of experimentation around phantom limb syndrome,
right.
experiments, for example, where he would have someone sort of on one side of a wall or a door with an amputee or whatnot. Where a lot of times, what's interesting is that even people who are congenitally uh, bereft of an arm or leg will still feel as
Hmm,
if they have a presence there. Okay, so they put the arm through the door, the phantom limb,
hmm,
as it were, and then there's a person on the other side who may be established as having a certain sensitivity, and the tests they indicate the degree to which other people can actually encounter the phantom limb independently. It's interesting
hmm,
stuff, and it intersects, as I said, a broader range of phenomena, which are sometimes deemed quote unquote paranormal. Um, I think it's interesting that these people were focusing on these kinds of things as well. And part of it is that not all of them, I'm sure some of them were well intended, but I also am inclined to advert that there are motivations at hand which are less than benign. Um, I think that the Russians did a lot more with that stuff, I think, than we did. But uh,
possibly,
it's just an
likely,
interesting it's an interesting example that you proffer. So
it is. And also, just to make sure that I so just to make it clear in my connection with Turing, I don't believe that Turing himself actually physically attended the Macy conferences, but in his connection with the racial club in England, Turing was you could view him. This is my understanding, and if anyone watching this uh, finds this incorrect, I would love to read uh, um, corrections in the comments of your video. But my understanding is that Turing was sort of connected with in a sort of Republic of Letters type of sense through uh, individuals within his network. And in the UK, um, the racial club was largely as an informal working group, both in communication with and aiming at the same type of work as the group of individuals connected to the Macy Foundation Cybernetics Conferences. And actually, on Turing's end,
So
a
what is
lot
the
of this
racial
work led to.
club? So, oh,
I'm sorry.
sorry. What is the racial? What was the racial club? What was
Oh,
it?
so
What
the.
was its intention?
Mhm.
If you could, yeah, because we're starting to run
Oh
up
yeah,
against the time a little bit. I'm sorry to say. I'm
no
sorry,
problem.
but go on.
So
I apologize.
the race. Oh no apology needed. Um, the racial club was a rather interesting group of intellectuals in the UK. They were formed in the late 1950s, and Alan Turing was a very central member within that group, to my understanding. And they were
Are
kind
they
of
fair?
a dining club. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Is it fair to infer from their sobriquet that they were involved in broadly eugenic speculation?
No, this would be racial, spelled RATIO. They were more
Oh,
involved in mathematics.
ratio, right, or ratio. The ratio, not racial. Okay, I got you.
Right.
Got you. Sorry,
I'm
misheard you.
sorry for not clearly are
The
enunciating,
ratio
but
club. So
yes,
they're probably sort of similar to the Vienna Circle, right? There are a bunch of sort of
yeah, yeah.
Anglo-American sort of analytic style thinkers taken up with certain problems originated by people like Frege and so forth. Russell, I imagine Bertrand Russell, at least flirted with them. I
Mhm.
wouldn't be surprised if,
I thought Russell was fairly. I could be completely mistaken. I thought Russell was actually more than flirted with him. It was
well, I don't know. I'm just guessing.
not deeply involved, but
It
I
sounds like
could
it's
be
up his
completely wrong.
alley, right? But in any event, you have this sort of motif or these sets of motifs that are very bullish on the capacity of what you might refer to as rationality, but specific type of rationality, namely a rationality that wanted to emphasize the mathematical and the logical as the categories of cognition which had which were most promising as paradigms of understanding. So you have people like Frege who were trying to reduce language to formally logical system and so on. And certainly Russell and Albert North Whitehead and their Principia Mathematica, attempting a certain thing which was then submarined by Kurt Gödel. But the reason it's important to bring these people up in connection, I imagine, with the Macy Club is because, or the Macy Conferences, is because the latter likely derived a sort of smug confidence from their conviction that their attachment to mathematical reasoning vis-a-vis people in the Ratio Club and similar organizations grounded the legitimacy of their own efforts, which I take to be broadly um, circling around control and psychological control and medical control. Is that
Yes,
a,
and
is that about the sum of it?
I think
And
that's fairly. I think
and
that's
and,
fair.
and then what
Yeah.
you find interesting is the set of personalities which inhabit these groups. So there's the groups, and we can sketch
Initially,
their right. That's what sort of drew you to them.
yeah, and the personalities and their role in molding um, 20th century and now 21st century culture and society. Um, and
And
I mean, also
presumably
like
political decisionality.
definitely, yeah, definitely. And
And I'm guessing they played an special role in the British Empire.
yes, but also a role in the for in I guess what we we could call the American Empire as well. Because we're looking at an Anglo, this is where the Five Eyes group becomes very interesting
Yes,
decades
maybe
after this.
we can.
Yeah,
What
but
are the five lines?
yes. So the Five Eyes.
EYE, I
So
believe.
it's a rather uh, amusing. It's one of these intelligence spook puns. They are most definitely punsters, uh, possessed of some humor. So the Five Eyes represent the five predominant Anglophone. I mean, it's basically the Anglosphere, excluding poor India, because I think India and Pakistan both rightfully are members of the Anglosphere, as well as a few former African colonies, Jamaica, um, probably Trinidad, and a few
Singapore,
other places in the West Indies. But from
maybe,
the
maybe.
from the prospect of the global North, um,
Right.
the most powerful entities of the global North, I guess everyone else they don't count. But Australia, the former colonies and dominions, because let it not be forgotten that Canada, I believe, technically is still a dominion of Great Britain, even though it's also an independent country. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom itself, United Kingdom of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland,
And
and the United
Wales.
States of America, and Wales. Oh God, I hope the Welsh forgive me for. Well, you see, just out of honor, I'm sure the Welsh would like to be left out of it. So,
Right. Well, they'd all
but
be like to
yes,
let out of it, except for the English. Okay.
yes,
All right. So I probably should let sleeping dogs lie as far as all that goes. But
yeah, it's basically everyone with
so the
the
five eyes
Queen Mom's
alliance.
face on their currency, with the exception of we Yanks. We get George Washington shoved in our bills, but America is the primary like eye. So these are the people whose spooky eyes are peering into everyone else's business. So the Five Eyes is an intelligence alliance, and it was allusion was made to it in the second to the last penultimate James Bond flick, the Daniel Craig one, Spectre. Uh,
I think that's the
the
anti-penultimate.
yes, you're right.
Not to be pedantic.
No, please be pedantic.
Of course, it's hard. It's hard
Um,
not to be pedantic when you're using a word like anti-penultimate.
but yeah, it's the consortium. Well, a fictional version of the consortium was a plot point inspector, if I recall correctly. Basically, the evil organization Spectre, this octopus whose arms were, well, tentacles were all over the world, were using, that's sort of the great imminence behind the scenes collectively, the United Kingdom to consolidate all the intelligence agencies of the civilized world into this vast intelligence sharing network to keep everyone safe in an age of omnipresent terror or terrorism or both. Um, that fictional consortium was an echo of the real Five Eyes alliance, which was largely established by the UK USA agreement, with the UK USA treaty. And it was initially set up to share signals intelligence, um, tap overseas cables, satellite transmissions, do interceptions of mobile phone traffic and things of that nature. And as the internet grew, um, it largely grew into intelligence collection across the internet. And it's the kind of stuff that Edward Snowden largely leaked a lot of information about. WikiLeaks has discussed, not discussed, has published a lot of leaked information about it. John Young, the New York-based architect who has run Krypton, which preceded WikiLeaks as a sort of intelligence leak. I guess you could say.
Clearinghouse.
So yeah, like a central, kind of like like an online clearinghouse of leaked intelligence community information.
So let me ask you
Krypton.
by way
Oh,
of
go ahead.
clarification, right? So the Five Eyes, you obviously have in any one of these polities numerous so-called intelligence groups. So like, we have the CIA and the NSA, and they've got the MI5 and so on and so forth, right? But the I is not actually associated strictly with any one of these agencies, right? The idea is that behind these agencies, there are other
Yeah, I think so. Like
people
basically,
making
people,
decisions.
yeah, and kind of the decision maker.
Men,
Go ahead.
top people. We're putting it with top people.
Top men. They
To
have top
allude
men on this.
Indiana Jones or whatnot,
Yes.
So. But the Ark of the Covenant is in a warehouse somewhere in Toledo. I don't know.
Yeah.
Much
Thank God they
of the
got rid of that
consternation.
skull, though. That magnetic crystal skull was just a little.
So the reason that's actually like
Oh.
an important point, right? Not the Indiana Jones thing, right? But that you're not actually dealing with like, there's like, this is where you get into some very, I think, interesting historical connections, which aren't even controversial, but which this shows like, the idea is that intelligence agencies are ancillary, derivative, secondary to the business of the nation state. But when you look at phenomena such as you're discussing here, where you have conferences like the Macy Conferences, essentially a philanthropic effort, alliance with things like the Ratio Group, and then they ultimately are are working in tandem with intelligence organs themselves, part of a sort of nested layer of people who are difficult to track down. Then you would sort of run into some very interesting material, even in terms of like global, in terms of geopolitics. Like when you start looking at who is actually inhabiting these agencies, and this is why the personality point is. The CIA initially, as I understand it, was staffed by not a trivial amount of former Nazis. Okay, that we appropriated these Nazis after the World War II, and they came over and they were used to staff the CIA, which is connected with other. So to what extent, under this veneer of like the Five Eyes, is there really even national difference? I mean, I know I'm like sort of jumping ahead to like a bigger sort of set of questions that I really had intended to access in this interview, right? But do you think that that trajectory, which I'm pointing, is one that should be pursued?
Personally, yeah. I mean, I have no answers, but just as far as my personal beliefs and what I glean from the literature I've read, I think there are some difficult questions, and it's difficult to avoid sliding into what might contemptuously be termed conspiratorial thinking or conspiracy theorizing, although conspiracies are fairly banal. You go to your average middle school and you will find every middle school classroom chock full of conspiracies. And it's just what humans do. People often intrigue together in collusion to accomplish ends that they would rather often keep secret from their schoolmates or the other clique of mean girls who sit on the other side of high school cafeteria, or this other group in the office. I mean, this is what people do, and this is imminently what governments do in organizations representing institutionalized, um, centralized capital, and um, institutions of governance, like, and criminals, which may include sometimes people in official standing, or at least in non-official standing as well, but um, with some degree of massive social and political agency. Um, it's said that behind every great fortune is a great crime. I don't know if that's true, but it certainly sounds like a spiffy saying, and it rolls out easily on the tongue. But I think one could definitely say that behind every great nation state are a set of great crimes, and um, conspiracy is legally defined as more than one individual working, I mean, secretly in collusion with each other to accomplish criminal ends which they would rather um, remain secret. I mean, there's U.S.
Well,
code
by such a
definitions. There's
definition, I mean, isn't that what
yes.
the central intelligence? Okay,
Well,
well, anyway, that's
if
just,
if they
I,
make I guess if you make the laws, then maybe it's not technically conspiracy of a criminal nature. So if you make intrigue,
no,
right,
it is.
collusion, whatever.
They're criminal. They do criminal things all the time, every day, right now, today. Who knows how many? Not just the CIA, the NSA. I mean, their business is the business of deception and control. That's their business, and it's hard to be involved in deception and control, and not be involved in, if not outright evil, something which is criminal in nature.
And
Um,
I personally like to, when I look at the actions of people with whom I vehemently disagree or who I find problematic, I think it's important to have some real empathy. And I'm not just being tongue in cheek. I mean, it's you.
everyone's a person, so you have to
Yeah,
distinguish between, someone works for the CIA. Yeah, I'm sure they're a person too.
yeah.
Okay.
And you
But
have
I mean,
people who sincerely believe. Well, I think you have a lot of very cynical people. I can't imagine having certain jobs and not being a profoundly cynical human being. But at the same time, people they have jobs, and their job is to either protect the country or the nation state or the government, or protect its interest. The nation as a corporate body. Um, to protect its interest from their enemies. And heavy, cliche time, heavy is the head that wears the crown. I mean,
so this
as
is
someone who's an
actually
anti-authoritarian, I don't like uh,
crowns in
centralized
general.
power.
They
Yeah, I
might
don't like
be
crowns in general.
crowns might be useful in dentistry, but elsewhere I think not.
Yes, and
And
even still, there's some holistic dentists who find crowns to be a little problematic as
yeah,
well,
well,
because
I'd be broadly sympathetic with that view. Um, but what's interesting about this line is that it actually draws a circle back to Scientocracy and how people can be perhaps drawn initially in a good faith fashion into projects that are bad faith in nature. And there's various ways that one can sort of direct the manner of completing this circle.
yeah, I think
On the
you
more cynical, on the more
mentioned
cynical side,
ideological capture, right? As
right?
an interesting.
And
I cut you
and
off.
then well, no, it's okay. I'm just gonna suggest that you talk about defending a society against its enemies. It begs a question of who are the enemies. And then the issue becomes whether this particular set of ideologies that seem to be present in elite circles lead to defining the enemy as the people who constitute the country. And then this translates into control and deception and surveillance and all the rest of it in order to keep them from undermining the state which they inhabit. I imagine that is the perverse rationality of people who serve these projects, but it's all in the name of science or a particular understanding of science, which is difficult.
I mean, to be fair,
I,
are some particular understandings of science, because there might be a few competing ones at work at the highest levels, but yeah.
Well, you could say it's scientistic or scientism as opposed to science per se, if you want to retain the purity of the word science is connected with a specific methodology, which, while potent, is yet limited in its epistemic capacity.
I think scientism is very much an appropriate theme to address when looking at these sort of historical intellectual projects. So that I think there are hegemonic ideologies that sometimes capture groups of people, groups of intellectuals, groups of thinkers, policymakers, scientists, cryptocrats, intelligence officers, and yeah, I mean, it would be easy for me to just say, okay, not just condemn people as deluded, but as like willingly self-deceptive. But at the same time, some could say, well, you don't see the data, you don't see the threats that we see every day coming in, and you have no idea what we save the general population from. Churchill once made reference to the rough hands who protect the king. I'm going to butcher that quote. Actually, I'm not even going to try. But basically, the idea is that you have some fairly rough individuals whose efforts enable we soft civvies, we soft civilians to sleep well at night. And
I mean, it brings to mind a few like tropes, right, in popular presentation. I remember the episode of like True Detective, for example. There's like a moment of sorts between the two detectives played by Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, and I can't remember the exact line, but it's the effect that we are awful men, but we are here to stop other even more awful men. Or you can go to like the A Few Good Men, the movie, Tom Cruise, Jack Nicholson talks about that you can't handle the truth, right? And it would be disingenuous of me to pretend that perspective is entirely without merit. However, I think when it comes down to constituting what is it going to be a human being, be a human society, it's not ultimately acceptable. What's ultimately necessary is for all of us collectively to confront the realities of the world and not admit to this notion that there are those of us who need to be protected because we're too gentle.
it's very patronizing.
That's actually a form of condescension. You're saying that some people can't handle it, and I'm saying that no, actually, though, how you go about disclosing these realities to people varies contextually. Ultimately, we all have a resource in terms of soul and spirit to rise and address the challenges of the world. And the ultimate challenge, of course, is a problem of human evil. That's like the, you know, the elephant in the room.
Hmm. Much evil in the world is done by men who are seeking nothing but good, and who are not only convinced that, you know, it's this whole sort of kind of reductive recourse to the idea of a greater good. I mean, maybe there's some truth to. Many things are contextual, right? So, just to use a metaphor, a surgeon may wrought great violence upon a body, slicing, cutting in, removing entire organs, spilling blood all over the um, operating room theater, and just surgery is a very violent, invasive act, um, but it's often a necessary act when it's not just being done to increase like billables to insurance companies, and to pad out a surgeon's 401k, right? That's me being cynical, but this does happen. There's a good deal of unnecessary surgery. Well, there's a good deal of unnecessary medical procedures of any nature that are done, but that doesn't invalidate um, the utility and usefulness and necessity of the same medical treatment, the same surgery, or the same procedure when done for the right reason on the right individual. Um, Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to cut off someone's arm if it's riddled with gangrene. Sometimes you have to cut into a chest and operate on a lung. And yeah, I'm butchering this, no pun intended,
Well,
but
no,
I'm butchering this metaphor. But I think it's kind of apropos here. Um, yes, you could, one could take the perspective of being a monster to some degree morally, but being a monster to fight greater monsters. I think one of the tragedies of human history, and it's one of these things that are very rarely observable to the people on the ground at the time, is the degree to which um, a lot of mutual human monstrosity is simply not only not needed, but can just be not evaded, just transcendent, bypass. Like, there are a lot of things that aren't necessary, but the limited logic of the participants in a historical action, some warlike nature, let's say, um, some violent action, some heinous act that we would see as criminal, to the people wrapped up within the logic of the conflict or the interaction, they may not be able to see viable options outside of the um, monstrous acts of violence that they are engaging
they're
in.
trapped within a situation.
Yes, they're trapped
And
within the situation. And
so,
often, mhm.
um, well, we should wrap it up here. I'm sorry to be somewhat
Oh,
abrupt in bringing it
no,
to an
no.
adjournment, because certainly it's not an end, right? But
Yeah,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry for diving down rabbit holes.
No, 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 no. And you hardly, it's not that you haven't gone down. Everything is relevant. The problem is that it's sprawling. So you have to make decisions. But to draw around, right, like what you have is a failure of imagination. And I think which is, but there's also like the the exigency of trust. Like ultimately the way forward is to trust people whom you don't know.
Yes.
And it shouldn't be as difficult as it is. Um,
but it can be very difficult in low trust societies or low trust situations. And
Oh yeah,
I think
that's what
this
I'm
is
trying
where
to say.
ideology, yeah, it's like if you are captured by a sort of hegemonic ideology that has a very reductive, almost game theory like, uh, dare I say, sociopathic way of viewing human conflicts. And if it's like, okay, they are most definitely going to screw me within, you know, maybe a 98 degree of, not 98% degree of confidence, right? They're going to screw
Right.
me over somehow. And maybe 2 degrees, know, you know, I don't know,
So
maybe 2% degree of
yeah,
confidence that they won't.
you can see
I'm sorry, go
why
ahead.
someone might well, it just reminds me of this anecdote about the early days of game theory at the Rand Corporation, which I thought was incredibly
We're
instructive. Right,
connected to all of this in a very sprawling way, but
and was it John Nash and those guys who came up with it, right? But then I not necessarily not Nash personally, but these other people thought that it would be interesting to see about the application of game theory to human interaction. So they said, "Oh, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set our secretaries against each other." And they did all this sort of calculation and figured it. Oh, we're going to say this to Judy and so on and so forth. Right? And it completely backfired. They tried it on multiple occasions, and every time what happened was the secretaries, instead of then descending into some kind of ridiculous internecine office theater politic, okay, they ended up communicating with each other and coming to a solution can vis-a-vis consensus or whatnot, right? And it's just completely undermined or just demonstrated right at the outset as to how game theory, as it's born, doesn't understand human beings because it has this
yeah.
uh, which might be, I think, like a nice point upon which to sort of tie it up here. But let me leave it to you to have the closing word.
Oh, I think that's a brilliant point. And I think it points out the almost, I don't want to choose my words carefully, but I think there's a very inhuman way in which many of our contemporary society, well, globally across the board, but particularly within the Anglosphere, um, not limited to it, but the Five Eyes countries, um, which largely monopolize global power and are at the top of the world's pecking order. The many, not all, but many of the people in charge to some degree, the sort of policymaking elites, uh, higher level political elites, the people who largely articulate um, on an official and unofficial level um, policy, right, and law. Um, these people, many of them, have a way of viewing human nature that's kind of disconnected from real lived human realities and lived human experiences. And dare I say, there's something somewhat inhuman here, which I think interestingly connects to the whole cybernetics project in trying to understand the human mind as a set of feedback mechanisms, like steering ships, um, steermanship, uh, looking at circular feedback loops and feedback mechanisms and control mechanisms. And
Yes.
this understanding of cybernetics has influenced the development of modern computing technology, which is capable of amazing things. I mean, like what we're communicating on, but at the same time, is based on an idea of the human mind, the human brain, the human neurology that while may be a useful model or set of models at a certain level, leaves out vast spheres of lived human experience. And I think there's a certain kind of empathy deficit here that you sometimes see visibly come across in the communication of individuals from these sorts of strata of society. And it's beyond very problematic. Like if you can't wrap your mind around the fact that in the normal lived reality of human beings, we have ways of resolving conflict, communicating with each other, empathizing with each other, eh, to kind of overcome this sort of like, well, I'm going to screw him before he screws me, kind of dynamic. That's a very impoverished view of human reality, and it's useful for building like supercomputers. All right, yeah, but it's not useful to understand vast swaths of lived human experience, to just keep repeating myself endlessly. And I think that anecdote that you shared points at a lot of what people find very problematic about these sorts of working groups like the X Club, which we didn't go into, which produce brilliant thought and brilliant thinkers. Um, the I will not say racial club anymore. Um, but the
What
Macy
is
conferences.
ratio? Right, it's a ratio club.
Well, it should be ratio, or what
Oh,
would
well,
you prefer?
colloquially ratio. I mean, you can say ratio too. I don't know. It's probably a tomato situation. Just as long as you have
Potatoes,
as long as you
potato.
have the umlaut, the invisible umlaut,
Yeah,
ratio, then it doesn't sound like right anyway. So ratio. Anyway, whatever.
whatever. But yeah,
Yes.
if you explore some of these
So yeah,
interconnected
we'll have to
clubs.
circle
Mhm.
back to like the X Club and so forth.
Yeah.
I just unfortunately the space and time press upon me,
Mhm.
and so I'm afraid we have to sort of leave it for the moment. Um, but thank you, Kamal. It's always impressive, like your command of these things, like who
Oh,
you know the who's who and all that sort of thing. And
not
even
really.
though we didn't probably get into as much Minutia as may have been desired by some, I think it was a very useful introduction. So thank you for that.
It was fun. It was very enjoyable. So,
We'll be
so
back. We'll be back with more. So down the line, I hope. So
same here.
any other
Well, thank you,
closing
Tom.
thoughts?
It was a pleasure. Um, I would say, at the risk of being terribly cliched and silly, just love each other. Let's just be humans, and let's not try to
Yes, sir.
control each other.
Right on, right on. All right.
Groovy.
Well, on that app note, we're out for now. And thank you guys all for listening. Thank you, Kamal. Talk to you later on.
Thank you, Tom. Have a wonderful
Ciao.
night. Ciao.
Bye.